Welcome to Setting Limits on Behaviors at Home. My name is Phyllis Barrington, and with me are Dr. Melissa Call and Rebecca Skinner. They are also part of the Florida Diagnostic Learning Resource Systems, which is a discretionary project with the Bureau of Exceptional Student Services and the Department of Education. Um, Today, we're just going to talk about setting those limits in the home. And hopefully, we'll be able to get through this. And if you have any questions, please make sure that you just type it in the chat pod. We will do some activities that will require you to type in the chat pod. So please do that and let's get started. On our agenda this evening, we're going to talk about our own limits that we set for ourselves, why we set those limits, when to set those limits. We're going to talk about the difference between limits versus ultimatums, how to set the limits once we realize we need them, what's the difference between firm and soft limits, and using choice language. So, hopefully you have a sheet of paper or something around where you can just jot down some notes, but I also want you to do this little activity right now. Um, the dictionary term for limits is the final, utmost, or furthest boundary or point as to extent, amount, continuance, procedure, etc. So we have to think about those. What is a limit first? So on a piece of paper, fold the paper in the middle vertically, do a section where it says your limits, and then on the other have those limits that have been set for you. So those are imposed limits. And think about what are some of the personal limits that you set for yourself. And then what are some of those imposed limits that we have to follow day to day? And once you've done that, if you could just type something in the chat about what are some of those limits that you have set for yourself. I know Dr. Call and myself have both talked about eating sweets. So I know that was something that's a personal limit that we set for ourselves about our intake of sweets. Sometimes I have to set a spending limit for myself. And that's just something that I know that I have to put on myself because we as adults tend to overspend sometimes. Just because you have the money doesn't mean you have to spend it. And those imposed limits, the imposed limits that we have are like speed. Every day we get up, we get in our cars, and you'll see the sign that says 45, and we know we're doing 60. We're breaking that limit. Or we know that we're supposed to be at a certain weight, and it's an imposed limit if you think about the chart that we have to go on. When you go to the doctor's office, and the first thing the doctor's going to say is, you need to lose some weight. So that's an imposed limit. So think about some of those limits. And we're going to come back to these personal and imposed limits a little later. So, as adults, most adults, we have coping skills, and our brains are capable of empathy, decision making, and social skills. And we set and we still test those limits. You think about it, we're supposed to be at work at 8 o'clock, and some of us still tend to come in at 8:15. This is a daily occurrence. You'll test that limit. We have to remember that kids are still learning those things. We have to acknowledge that we, as adults, test limits even though we know why they exist. We also have to acknowledge that it is unreasonable to expect our kids to never test the limits. So, do you test your self imposed limits? We've all done it. We've all done it. Do you test those limits that have been imposed on you? In order for your household to be successful, these need to be in place first. So we have to look at setting the stage. We have to make sure that we have routines and procedures in place. We get up, we go to bed at a certain time, we get up in the morning, the first thing we do is brush our teeth, we put our clothes on, whatever the procedure is and the routine of the household. Then you have your household rules and expectations. Some of those are specific rules, and then some of them are general. We have to know what the difference is when it comes to specific rules and expectations and those general rules. So when we talk about the specific rules, those are the ones that we teach them. If they are posted or taught in the house, you may want to write them down and hang them on the fridge. These are things that are specific to your house. Okay? When it comes to our general rules, they're more hidden expectations, but you may need to be teaching these as well if they're unclear to your kids. They can also be those different expectations between caregivers in the family. Dad may expect one thing, mom expects something entirely different, and then grandma lets the kids do whatever they want. And we have to think about that because we live with all of our, we have parents that live together, or we have our children are going from home to home because parents work all these different and odd hours. Grandma allows this or granddad allows this, but when they get back home, they got to remember that this is just a specific rule at our house. Grandma lets me do this one over here, and it's a general rule at our house. Um, at the end, we want to make sure that we have those positive interactions. So when they are doing good, we always say this, even in our behavior, all of our behavior trainings, when you catch them doing good, always reward them for that. That's what we want to see. Whatever it is that you want to see, we have to let them know that we appreciate them doing that. Okay. So on your paper, think about some of those behaviors that you are currently addressing now. The reason you're here is because there have been some behaviors probably that you want to address. And you can do this activity on your own or with another family member. Sometimes share it with your children. Share a behavior in the home if they would like that you would like to address. And what do you say and what do you do when that behavior occurs? So think about that. Select one of those behaviors from your list. How are you currently addressing that behavior? And write down what you say when that behavior occurs. Now, do all of this now because we're going to come back to these same questions near the end. Okay? So, why do we set limits? We set limits so that we teach our kids how to make good decisions. We want them to think before they act because all of our actions have consequences. Okay? Kids are natural researchers. You have to understand that they test the limits to see what they can get away with. They do it with you. So imagine they do it with their teachers. Create a safe and consistent environment. You need to set those boundaries. Boundaries must be in place to keep all individuals safe and predictable. Boundaries, children look for those. You want to be able to diffuse a potentially escalating situation. Make sure you have healthy disagreements without anger. That's what they need to see. Increase in positive interactions in the home. When we do that, we're teaching them that just because I said no doesn't mean that we have to be on there has to be a bad relationship here. It just eliminates those power struggles at the end. So if the behavior is an issue in the home, it is important that all adults in the family are consistent. We need to all be on the same page. We want it to look the same from every parent or every adult in the house when we're imposing those limits. So when should we set those limits? The limits should be set when a child is defensive, when they're being belligerent, when they begin to challenge your authority, or refuse to follow directions. These are things that we have to put in place. That's when they need to be put in place. That's when we have to set those limits. Um, if the selected behavior is not indicative or indicative or of defensive behavior, then maybe we are reacting inappropriately to things that are simply annoying. In that case, we should readdress the behavior. So you have to look at the behavior you selected. Is it defensive or is it just a button pusher? Because you have to think about us as parents after a long day of work. It doesn't take much for someone to push our buttons, especially our children. Okay, so just look at those things. So when we are setting those limits, there are three questions that you have to ask yourself. The first one is, can I still do what I need to do? Can my child still do what he or she needs to do? And can my family still do what they need to do? This is very important. This should be a self-talk for any caregiver when choosing whether or not to engage with a child. If you answered yes to any of these questions, do not engage in the behavior. Okay? So an example of that would be your child does not like cleaning their room and often has a tantrum when they're told to do it. Everyone in the family is cleaning on Saturday morning and your child is loudly complaining while they're doing their chores. Keyword, while they're doing their chores. The parent can still continue to clean. The child is cleaning and everyone else is still cleaning. This should be an acceptable alternative to throwing a tantrum and not cleaning. We can work on cleaning with a smile on our face later, but for now, don't risk the tantrum by intervening. They're doing what you want them to do, which is cleaning. Maybe a little talk back, but they're cleaning. Once the cleaning is done, acknowledge the positive for completing the task and then address the loud complaining because I want my room clean. At the end of the day, they clean the room. Now I'm going to address it later because now my room is clean. Okay? So everyone should be able to identify when a specific rule is broken. So when they are general rules, they are harder to determine and may be enforced less consistently. So a child is breaking a household rule. If it's very specific, they understand what the consequence will be. If it's general, it's a touch and go situation. You look at the behavior that you selected. Is it breaking a specific rule or expectation? Yes or no? Or is it general? Is it breaking a general rule or expectation? You have to ask yourself that. If it's specific, they already know what the consequence is going to be because you've already explained that to them. When it comes to general, it really is, you know, the luck of the draw, depending on which parent sets or imposes that limit that day. It just depends on the day. But you have to be specific. That's why we say be specific about those limits that you want to set for your child. So, how do we set those limits? How to set those limits? You have to pre-plan your limits to be simple. They have to be clear, reasonable, and enforceable. We as parents are sometimes surprised by the consequences or punishments that we establish when we are upset. You can't believe that you set that punishment. If we already know what the limits will be and everyone is consistent, it will be easier to enforce. A good example is I know this has happened with me and my brother when we were growing up, kids slapping each other in the back of the seat on a road trip, and the parent says, if you don't stop, I'm going to turn this car around. Simple, yes. Yes, it's simple. Is it clear? Yes. She made it quite clear that she was going to turn that car around. Was it reasonable? Probably not, because I already know you spent all this money getting ready to take us to the house of the mouse, and you're not going to waste your money. Where the cost can be refunded, I doubt seriously, but was it enforceable? I knew at the end of the day, it probably wasn't going to be, she wasn't going to turn that car around, but there was going to be other consequences that I probably wouldn't have preferred. Um, but that is entirely up to what you are willing to do as a parent. You have to make sure that it's something that's enforceable. Threatening your child never works because they know how far you're going to take it. They know you're not going to do anything more than what it is, what you're saying. So, how to set limits. There are two types of limits. You have those firm limits and those soft limits. Firm limits, they point out that there is a choice and an option that is better for the child. There are clear limits where the child can understand. Example on the page, it says you can play by the rules or find another game to play. You can sit together quietly or sit apart quietly. Those are choices. Those are firm, it's an either or. When it's a soft limit, it's unclear, and children can manipulate that limit. Do me a favor and pay attention. Okay, I can do it, or I don't have to. Um, would you like it if I interrupted you? You may not like the response that you get from that child. Soft limits, if the child is upset with you, they are not going to do you a favor. It also puts the behavior on you, not them. Do not ask a yes or no question unless both answers are acceptable. What you're doing is truly inviting a power struggle. So, talking about those limits versus ultimatums. The first thing I can say about this is do not negotiate the consequence while you are setting limits. Do not negotiate the consequence that has been put in place while you are setting limits. Limits have to have a positive choice with a consequence, meaning their choice that goes along with the consequence. If they choose to do this, they understand what the consequence will be if they follow along with that choice that they decided on. Um, it has to be directly related to the behavior. We always want to make sure that it is predictable and logical. It's predictable. We know what to expect, and this is the necessary act that should be happening. We love to give choice. So power of choice given to a child makes it so much easier when you give them a choice and they make that decision and they have to live with that decision. When they live with that decision, they have to live with that consequence that's going to be given by you as the parent. So those limitations that you've put there are firm. They're there for a reason. When it comes to ultimatums, it becomes punitive consequences with no choice. It's going to hurt them for a short period of time, but it's a consequence that's going to hurt them. And the thing is, are they learning from it? Another ultimatum is indirect or no relation to the behavior. You're punishing them for something that's not related to the behavior that they expressed. It's not predictable. It's unpredictable. When it comes to ultimatums, they're very unpredictable. You don't know when it's going to happen. It's just going to happen. And they often result in power struggles, whereas there's always one up. You're always going to be in this cycle of, I'm not doing it. Yes, you are. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. So that struggle will continue until somebody has to win. And there's never a winner when it comes to a power struggle. So characteristics of firm and soft limits. When we look at firm limits, It has to be stated in clear, direct, concrete terms. The words have to be supported by the actions. We want to make sure that compliance is expected and required. We don't sit here and guess, it's expected. Um, Make sure that we are providing the information that will be needed to make choices and cooperate. And finally, we want to make sure that they have accountability for what they've done or going to do. When it comes to those soft limits, um, it's stated in unclear terms or given a mixed message. They don't know if you're going to be happy or sad about this. You're going to get upset or mad. It's not very clear. Actions do not support the intended rule. Compliance is optional. It's not required. I can do it if I want to. I may not get any, there may not be any consequences to this. Um, Finally, do not provide information needed to make choices. And that's when it comes to those soft limits. An example here might be that mom is at Target with the child who is crying about wanting a toy. And the mom says repeatedly, if you don't stop, we're going to go home. But you never leave the store. The words were not supported by your actions. Compliance is optional because look what you said. Stop crying or we're going to go home. And it sends a mixed message. So if you're not going to go home, the only way to be firm about this is go home. Most parents will continue to shop while that child is still whining and crying about a toy. If that's the case, let's just get up and go because at this point you set a soft limit, not a firm limit. Any questions so far? So when it comes to the outcomes of firm and soft limits, with firm limits, you get that cooperation. You get decreased limit testing. They stop testing you. They understand that you mean what you say and say what you mean. They clearly understand your expectations and what a parent says they take as serious. My mom said that this was going to happen. I believe her. And they don't fight you at every turn. When you're setting soft limits, you're going to constantly get that resistance from the child. You'll have that increased limit testing. They're going to always test your limits. As they get older, the behavior will begin to escalate. Power struggles will continue to happen. Eventually, they will ignore you or tune you out altogether. So when you decrease limit testing, remember that as an adult, we still test limits. So it's an unfair expectation to entirely eliminate that. We want to make sure that our kids understand what our limits are. Okay? And it's unfair for them not to, when the expectations aren't extremely clear, that we continue to argue with them or impose consequences when they don't understand. So when we have imposed those firm limits, what do they learn? With firm limits, they understand that no means no. I'm expected to follow the rules. Rules apply to me and everyone else. I am responsible for my own behavior, and adults mean what they say. Soft limits means no means yes sometimes or maybe. It's not firm. I'm not expected to follow the rules. I can get away with whatever. Rules are for others, not for me. And you've seen these kids. You've seen some children just like this. Parents to tell them no, and they still do it. Adults are responsible for my behavior. You're responsible for your behavior, and adults don't mean what they say. It is very important that children learn that no means no early in life. It's also important that they learn adults mean what they say even when they aren't yelling. You don't have to yell no for them to understand that you mean no. When they have a job, their boss will expect them to perform that task without having to shout at them to do it. Learning limitations early and understanding that you will encounter no just helps children to readjust their thinking that it's not a bad thing to be told no. Okay? So, there are 5 steps in setting limits. Steps 1 and 2 are part of teaching the rules and should be done long before they are necessary to enforce limits. Consequences should be predetermined so that they are enforceable. So we have to look at steps 1 and 2 where we explain which behavior is appropriate and explain why it's inappropriate. They have to understand these things in steps 1 and 2. Then we go on to step 3 and giving the child an opportunity to make a choice with logical consequences. Once you've explained what's appropriate and inappropriate, giving them the opportunity to make a sound, logical choice and understand what those consequences could be is the next step. And step 4, you want to allow time for the child to get used to those limits. You can't expect it to happen overnight. It's a behavior. Behavior does not change overnight. We tell our teachers, give it 10 days. Parents, the same. Give them 10 days. You've set a limit, give them 10 days. It's going to get worse before it gets better. Allow time for that child to get used to the limits and understand what is appropriate and inappropriate. And finally, in step 5, when a limit is broken and consequences are explained for the limits that were broken, enforce the consequence and explain why it's being enforced. So that's how we start setting our limits. This is where all parents and caregivers have to agree on the rules and post them. Take pictures of your kids following the rules, hang them up where the rules are posted. So this is something that we probably want to do. Explain which behavior is inappropriate. Should be in reference to predetermined rules. Be very clear. Avoid language like behave. Do they understand what behave means? Use language that is developmentally appropriate. We don't talk baby talk. We want to make sure that we're talking to our 9-year-old like they are truly 9 years old and they understand just regular language. Use visuals to support the message. Some of our kids may need visual supports to help them understand what is right, what's appropriate, and what's inappropriate. Another, don't assume the child knows why it's inappropriate. Explain to them why. You may have to revisit and reteach these rules frequently. That's something that happens over time. Again, I told you it's going to get worse before it gets better. So, how to set those limits? Give reasonable choices with logical consequences. Do not use an ultimatum. Remember, ultimatums are just things that you really can't enforce. Be fair. Make it a teachable moment. And consequences relate to the behavioral choice. Make sure that the consequence that you're imposing relates to the behavioral choice that the child made. An example would be an abuse of a privilege and they lose that privilege. Giving over your TV time by minutes, just a few minutes. Talking during the movie, you don't get to watch the movie with the family. Those types of things. Another, allowing time. Give your child time to process the limit that we set. The loss of rationality increases the processing time. We all take longer to process when we are upset. It's why we have those I should have said, I should have done moments when we are defensive about what someone else has said to us. So try to avoid repeating directions too frequently. Um, think, drop it, and go. Set your limit, step away, take a deep breath or count to 10, then see if your child is following the direction or making moves too. You may have to repeat yourself, but don't do it repetitively over and over. That will only intensify the situation. So, how do we set limits with consequences? Immediate and consistent is determined by the age and functionality of the child in question. Some kids can receive the consequence later that day or even a few days later, but not all can. Certain severity of the consequence doesn't have to be huge, but it does have to happen. Grounding a kid from their favorite things for weeks may be too severe and may increase other behaviors. It is important that the positive and negative consequences actually happen. So we want to make sure that the essential need and structure and boundaries are there. Make that consequence immediate and consistent. We want to have that severity, certainty, not severity of the consequence. Make it a learning opportunity, provide opportunities to make better decisions. What could you have done better now that you know? And making that connection with your child when you're giving them that choice. That's something that we always want to say. Give them a choice when they have a voice and they want to be heard, and you're giving them a choice, and that's what we want to do. So these are just some consequences along with punishments. So let's look at the first one. Brian, please go to your room for 10 minutes. I'll set the timer. He sits there and shut up until I say you could join us again. I don't want to hear a single noise from you. The consequence to me was much better than the punishment. Just go to your room 10 minutes, I'll set a timer, versus telling a child to shut up and until I say you can join us again. I don't want to hear a single noise from you. That's so harsh. And it tends to have pushback from that child. Sam, I don't talk like that. You owe me an apology. We will practice how to speak to me when you are upset. It's just a way to talk to a child. I had to learn that just because you get loud doesn't mean that it's going to happen. So the punishment under Sam, that's it, Sam. I've had enough. You've lost your video games for the week. Do you want to start losing next week too? So here we are imposing more harsher consequences and punishments for this child. And finally, you've been warned about running around the pool. We're going to practice walking around the pool for 5 minutes. It's a consequence. It's just a consequence. We're not punishing them. We're giving them a consequence. Now they have to understand we're being more explicit about what our expectations are. The punishment, I told you no running. Now you know you're raising your voice. What did I say to you? Everyone inside for the rest of the day. So now not only have you punished this child, you're punishing everybody now. So that's something we have to look at. When we enforce consequences, even when it's inconvenient, make sure that it's consistently enforced. You consistently enforce what it is that you are saying. Predetermine what the consequences will be and how are they going to be enforceable. And consider what you are willing to enforce. Again, if you are willing to enforce it, don't say it. If you aren't willing to enforce it, don't say it. If you aren't going to leave your full cart right there in Target, don't say we're going home if they don't stop. If you aren't going to turn your car around, don't say that you're going to turn that car around. You have to, if you're going to say it, you have to mean it. And they have to believe that you're going to do it. Using that choice language. When we begin using choice language, you remove the excitement. Um, you want to make sure that it's clear and matter of fact, and make sure that diffusers are there regardless or nevertheless. So when I say those things, you remove the emotion when the unwanted behavior happens. Be clear and a matter of fact about what the consequences will be. And no matter what the circumstances are, you will enforce the consequences. That's what that means. Okay? So when we're using that choice language, we want to make sure that we are encouraging our child. You may choose to, this is giving them a choice. You have chosen to do this. The consequences for your choices, and remember, consequences aren't always bad. Consequences can be good. In choosing to, you have chosen blah, blah, blah. And that's your choice, so you have to stick with it. And you have made your choice to do blah, blah, blah. You can't change it. Then we want to make sure that we encourage them to do those types of things by using that type of language. You discourage them when say you have to do this, you need to, you must. Stop. I'm sending you to your room. Don't tease her. Those types of things are discouraged and they're negative. Um, it just, when you say don't tease her, it just kind of legitimizes the teasing. Stop. Saying just stop without more information doesn't clarify what they need to fix. And I'm sending you to sends them a message that you can't handle whatever it is that they did, or and that you don't care what the outcome is. So you want to be very specific. That's why you want to make sure that you are using that choice language of encouragement. When we're using that choice language, we want to make sure it's non-judgmental language. Um, Definitely present a respectful attitude. I know the era that some of us grew up in, you were supposed to respect the adults, but it wasn't always displayed that way. But just presenting the respectful attitude gets you a whole different can of honey, a whole bottle of honey, different kind coming from our kids. These are different kids that we're raising today. Resist the urge to lecture. They're not willing to hear. They're already at a bad state now, so they don't want to hear a lecture. Stay calm. You have to kind of remain emotionally neutral and speak in a matter of fact manner. As the older a kid is, they are more likely to hear that they're going to get a lecture. Kids will tune you out, and it most likely miss the message. So that's something we kind of want to veer away from. We want to have constructive conversation with our kids at that point as they get older. So using choice language, this is an example. Janice, I want to make sure that you understand your choices. You may choose to continue to talk loudly during the movie, in which case you will be choosing to go to your room while we watch it, or you may choose to quiet down and watch the movie with the family. She was given a choice. The only reasonable thing for Janice to do, she can't debate it. She can either get quiet or she can go to her room while the family watches the movie. Using that choice language, that's how we do it. This is a very good example, but it's kind of wordy. Here's another one. You choose to hit, you chose to sit. Um, it can also be short and sweet. Less can be more. And this is very true. You chose to hit, you chose to sit. So that sometimes you just put them in time. It's not even a timeout. Go have a seat over here. You hit them, go have a seat. It's very short and sweet, and they understand that. So these are just some tips. You have to practice it when you're using that choice language. Things may get worse before they get better, and I've said that before. Kids are going to test you to see how serious you are. They want to make sure that you're imposing those firm limits and not those soft ones. And you can't give up because that's what they're expecting. They're going to keep pushing until they're going to keep pushing until you give in. So now on your paper, write how you would address that behavior using choice language. Think about that behavior that you're wanting to address now. And using choice language, how would you write it down? This is just a little bit of homework for you. So you're addressing that behavior that we've talked about in the beginning. Remember, you focusing on that one behavior or those few, and think about the choice language we just went through. And how would you address that behavior using choice language? This is a family to-do list. Do these things with the other caregivers in the family. If your kids can participate, it's great to get them involved for more ownership. Identify what pushes your buttons. Each one of you as caregivers, grandparents need to sit down and understand this too, because sometimes grandma, grandpa are picking up the kids from school and they need to understand what the limits are in your house. So when we are consistently on the same page, then they know we can't do this like we thought we could. Create specific household rules. You have to be specific about what are your household rules. Plan to teach and revisit those household rules and expectations. Pre-plan what your firm limits will be. I love this part right here. Pre-plan those enforceable consequences. When you talk about those firm limits, especially if you have your kids involved in this part of the plan, let them come up with the consequences if they break a limit. Because you'll find out they're much harder on themselves than we would be. Practice developmentally appropriate choice language. And we talked about that choice language just now. And finally, create necessary visuals. And if you need any type of support when it comes to visual supports for your child, please contact us at Fiddlers, and we will be more than happy to help you with some visual supports if we can.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a wonderful course. I love it. A plus. To the rest of you, have a great evening, and thank you for joining us.